There is a child following someone she should not be following. She is approximately 7 years old, which in the ancient world means she is old enough to be genuinely useful, old enough to understand instructions and follow them with reasonable reliability, and old enough to have developed strong opinions about which activities she finds interesting and which she finds tedious. At this particular moment, she has slipped away from the food processing area where she was supposed to be helping separate seeds from plant husks, a task she has assessed as exactly as boring as it sounds, and is following two of the group's best hunters at a distance that she believes is sufficient for concealment. It is not sufficient. One of the hunters noticed her about 3 minutes ago and has said nothing because this is not the first time this has happened, and because the child is actually moving quietly enough that, from a pure tracking perspective, there is something worth encouraging here. The other hunter has not noticed yet and will not notice until they make camp this evening, at which point the child will need to make a case for why she should be allowed to stay rather than be sent back, and she is already rehearsing that argument in her head while simultaneously trying to walk on the same rocks the hunters step on to avoid leaving footprints. She is learning, not in a classroom, not from a curriculum, not according to any externally organized program of instruction. She is learning the way that ancient children learned everything, by embedding herself in the activity, by watching experts, by attempting to replicate what she observes, and by finding the subject compelling enough to override the competing claims on her attention, including the considerable social cost of sneaking away from an assigned task. This is ancient childhood, and it was nothing like what most people imagine. Let's start by dismantling the assumption that ancient childhood was primarily a smaller, harder version of ancient adult life, that ancient children were essentially just less capable adults, put to work as soon as they were physically able and otherwise ignored. This picture is wrong in almost every specific. The evidence from developmental research, comparative anthropology, and the archaeological record of ancient childhood all point towards something significantly more interesting and significantly more human. Ancient children had childhoods, real, full, developmentally appropriate childhoods, organized around the specific cognitive and social needs of developing humans, with play, learning, social development, and the gradual, carefully managed introduction to adult knowledge and responsibility that human cognitive development actually requires. The specific form of ancient childhood was different from modern childhood in important ways. There was no formal education, no institutional structure, no separation of learning from living, but the developmental needs that education serves, the acquisition of knowledge and skills, the development of social competence, the gradual building of the capabilities that adult life requires, were served effectively by the specific structure of ancient community life. Ancient children grew up embedded in a community of adults and older children who were continuously engaged in the activities of survival. They had continuous access to expert practitioners in every domain their community's life required. They had the freedom to explore, to experiment, and to fail in contexts that were challenging enough to be developmental but safe enough to not be catastrophic. And they had the specific developmental resource that modern children often lack, and that ancient communities provided in abundance: time with multiple generations of competent adults who were genuinely invested in the child's development. Let's talk about play, because play was the primary occupation of young ancient children, and its specific forms in the ancient context were both recognizable and distinctively functional. Human play is not random. It is developmentally organized toward the specific competencies that adult human life requires. Children the world over play in ways that practice the physical skills, the social skills, and the cognitive skills that their particular cultural context will require of them as adults. The universality of specific play forms, physical play, pretend play, social play, rule-based competitive play, reflects the universal developmental needs that these forms serve. Ancient children played in all of these forms. Physical play, running, climbing, jumping, wrestling, built the physical capabilities and body awareness that adult hunting, gathering, construction, and travel required. The specific physical challenges of the ancient landscape, uneven terrain, obstacles to be climbed or crossed, physical competitions with peers, produced a form of physical development that was both comprehensive and environmentally calibrated to the actual physical demands the children would eventually face. Pretend play, the imaginative play in which children create and inhabit fictional scenarios, was in the ancient context specifically calibrated to adult activities. The documented play patterns of children in traditional communities consistently show a specific tendency toward adult activity imitation. Children playing at hunting with miniature versions of adult tools tools, playing at food processing with real materials in child-scaled quantities, building miniature versions of the shelters they watched adults construct. This is not simple imitation for its own sake. It is the specific developmental mechanism through which procedural knowledge is acquired and rehearsed before the stakes of actual performance become real. A child who has played at spear throwing for 3 years before they make their first real throw at real prey has already developed the motor patterns, the spatial reasoning, and the force calibration that the real throw requires. The play was the training program. No adult organized curriculum was necessary to make it happen. It happened because the activity was interesting to the child, because the child had observed skilled adults performing it and wanted to do what they did, and because the specific pleasure of developing skill is a fundamental feature of human motivation that requires no external incentive to activate. Let's talk about observation as the primary learning mechanism of ancient children, because this is where the ancient learning model diverges most dramatically from modern educational assumptions and where it reveals something important about how human learning actually works. Modern education is largely explicit and formal. A teacher with knowledge instructs a student without it through organized transmission of information. This is an effective model for some kinds of knowledge, but it is not the primary model through which human learning evolved. The evolutionary baseline of human learning is observational, the acquisition of knowledge and skill through the sustained observation of expert practitioners, followed by the gradual attempt to replicate what has been observed, followed by feedback from the environment and from the practitioner. Ancient children were embedded in an environment of continuous expert practice from birth. Every waking hour was spent in the company of adults engaged in the specific activities that community life required. The child who wanted to understand how to process a hide watched hide processing happening every day. The child who wanted to understand how to navigate the territory watched navigation happening in real time. The child who wanted to understand how plants were identified and collected watched plant collection happening as part of the ordinary flow of daily foraging. The knowledge transmission was not always explicit. Much of it happened through the child's own sustained observation and the gradual development of their own understanding. But it was also frequently explicit, in the specific form that makes sense in an apprenticeship context. Direct demonstration by an expert, followed by the child's attempt, followed by the expert's correction and guidance. Traditional knowledge transmission systems documented in ethnographic research consistently show this explicit embedded in implicit structure. The master artisan who occasionally provides direct guidance to the observing apprentice, while the apprentice's primary learning happens through sustained watching and doing. The critical difference from modern schooling is the integration of knowledge with practice. Ancient children were not learning about hide processing in the abstract. They were watching hide processing happening for the purpose of producing the specific hide that the family needed. The knowledge was never separated from its application context. The learning was never separated from the doing. This integration produces a specific quality of understanding, embodied, contextually grounded, functionally calibrated, that formal abstract instruction often struggles to produce even with significant educational investment. Let's talk about what different age groups of ancient children were actually doing each day, because the daily experience of a 2-year-old was radically different from that of a 12-year-old, and the age-specific structure of ancient childhood deserves specific attention. Very young children, from birth to approximately 3 years, in ancient communities were primarily in physical contact with caregivers, carried in slings or held during most of the day, and sleeping in close proximity to adults at night. Their developmental experience was dominated by physical sensation, social interaction with the specific small set of individuals who cared for them, and the ambient information of everything happening around them. They were not isolated from adult activity, they were embedded in it, experiencing every aspect of camp life from the vantage point of being carried by someone who was participating in it. This early immersion in community life was the beginning of the knowledge acquisition process. The infant carried while her mother processes plant foods is experiencing plant processing, its sounds, its smells, the specific movements required, the objects used, at the deepest possible learning level, pure sensory experience before any conscious cognitive processing is possible. The knowledge is being encoded in ways that will later support explicit learning with a familiarity that makes the explicit learning dramatically faster. Children from approximately 3 to 7 years in traditional communities studied anthropologically show a consistent pattern, primarily in the company of other children in age-mixed peer groups, with intermittent close contact with caregivers, and with play that is increasingly complex and increasingly oriented toward adult activity imitation. This age group is notably autonomous in many traditional communities, moving freely within the camp area, organizing their own play activities without adult direction, and making independent decisions about how to spend time within the broad parameters of community life. This autonomy is developmentally significant: the ability to manage your own time, to organize group activities with peers, to navigate the social dynamics of a peer group without adult mediation. These are skills that the relatively high autonomy of traditional childhood specifically develops. Modern childhood, with its higher levels of adult supervision and structured activity, may systematically underdevelop these specific capabilities in ways that have real developmental consequences. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's talk about the age-mixed peer group specifically, because it is one of the most distinctive and developmentally significant features of ancient childhood and one of the most different from modern childhood experience. In ancient communities, children of different ages spent most of their time together rather than with age-matched peers. A typical ancient children's play group might include a 4-year-old, a 6-year-old, 2 8-year-olds, a 10-year-old, and a 12-year-old, all playing together, with the older children taking implicit leadership roles and the younger children observing and learning from the older ones. This age mixing serves specific developmental functions that age-homogeneous peer groups cannot provide. Younger children in mixed groups are continuously exposed to more advanced skills, more complex knowledge, and more sophisticated social behavior than they would encounter in a group of age-matched peers. They are being taught not by adults with explicit instructional intent, but by older children who are demonstrating capabilities just beyond the younger child's current level, the specific learning zone that developmental psychologists identify as optimal for skill acquisition. Older children in mixed groups are simultaneously providing care and instruction to younger children, which serves their own developmental needs in specific ways. The consolidation of knowledge through teaching, the development of caregiving capabilities that are essential for eventual parenthood, and the social skills of managing responsibility for others. The 12-year-old who is the de facto leader and supervisor of a mixed-age play group is not just babysitting. She is developing the specific social and organizational competencies that adult community leadership requires. The peer group was also the primary social arena in which ancient children developed the interpersonal skills that adult community life would require. Conflict resolution, alliance formation, cooperation towards shared goals, the management of competitive dynamics within a group of long-term associates, all of these skills were practiced continuously in the crucible of the age-mixed peer group, with enough adult proximity to prevent serious harm, but enough autonomy for real social dynamics to develop and be navigated. Let's talk about the specific skills that ancient children were learning and at what ages, because the developmental timeline of ancient skill acquisition is both impressive and revealing. By approximately 5 to 6 years old, children in traditional hunter-gatherer communities studied anthropologically are typically capable of making genuine, if modest, contributions to household food acquisition. They can gather certain plant foods reliably, the specific plants whose location, identification, and collection is simple enough for a child to manage independently. They can fish in simple contexts, they can collect firewood, they can carry water. These are not token contributions, they are real additions to household caloric intake and resource supply. By 8 to 10 years, children are typically capable of more substantial contributions. Boys in many traditional communities are actively hunting small game, birds, small mammals, lizards, with miniature versions of adult hunting tools, making real kills and bringing real food to the family. Girls are typically capable of managing most aspects of food processing, plant food collection, and younger sibling care with adult-level competence in normal conditions. By 12 to 14 years, ancient adolescents were in most traditional communities considered to be in the final preparation phase for full adult capability. Participating in adult activities including the major hunts and extended foraging expeditions, taking on adult social responsibilities, and demonstrating the specific competencies that adult community membership required. This developmental trajectory is not the same as saying ancient children were simply laboring from early childhood. The activities that ancient children engaged in were age-appropriate, developmentally calibrated, and embedded in a social context that made them interesting rather than merely obligatory. The 5-year-old gathering berries was not doing the same berry gathering as an adult. She was doing it with peers, with the freedom to eat as she gathered, with the specific quality of absorbed, engaged attention that children bring to activities they genuinely find interesting. Let's talk about storytelling and knowledge transmission in the specific context of children, because this dimension of ancient childhood is one of the richest and most important. The evenings around ancient fires were not only adult social time, they were the primary context in which the community's accumulated knowledge, its history, its cosmological framework, its ecological wisdom, its social norms and values was transmitted across generations. And children were present, fully present, in the specific way that children are present when something interesting is happening: alert, attending, processing, remembering. The stories told around ancient fires served multiple simultaneous functions for children in the audience. They transmitted specific practical knowledge. Stories about successful hunts contained information about prey animal behavior, about hunting strategies, about the specific landscape features that made specific approaches effective. They transmitted social norms. Stories about how community conflicts had been resolved, about the consequences of specific kinds of behavior, about the qualities that made specific individuals respected or disrespected. They transmitted cosmological frameworks, stories about the forces that governed the natural world, about the relationships between the human community and the animals, and landscape features that surrounded it. Children acquiring this knowledge through stories were not passively receiving information. They were building cognitive models, representations of how the world worked, how people behaved, outcomes different choices produced that would later structure their own decision-making. The accumulated story knowledge of a childhood spent listening to ancient community storytelling was an extraordinary cognitive resource, providing reference frameworks for the interpretation of novel situations that the child would eventually face as an adult. Let's address something that is often missing from discussions of ancient childhood, but that the evidence consistently highlights. Ancient children were not always happy, not always willing, and not always cooperative. They were children, which means they had opinions. Strong opinions, frequently expressed, about which activities they wanted to participate in and which they did not, which caregivers they preferred, and which they found annoying, which peers they liked, and which they found intolerable. The specific negotiations, conflicts, and occasional spectacular meltdowns that characterize the relationship between children's preferences and adult community expectations are as old as childhood itself. The evidence from traditional communities studied by developmental anthropologists shows that ancient-style childhood involved significant child autonomy alongside the embedded learning structure we have described. Autonomy that sometimes produced the specific behaviors that every parent in every era has dealt with: resistance, avoidance, distraction, and the creative interpretation of instructions that technically complies with the letter while completely violating the spirit. The child at the beginning of this video, who is following hunters instead of processing seeds, is not an unusual ancient child. She is a completely typical ancient child, doing what developmentally appropriate ancient children did, pursuing the activities she found most compelling and least tedious, using the specific social intelligence that ancient children had in abundance to negotiate the gap between adult expectations and her own preferences. She will almost certainly be allowed to stay with the hunters tonight, not because she successfully argued her case, though she will make the argument, but because the experienced hunters recognize that the specific quality of her attention, her tracking instinct, and her persistence represent something worth encouraging. The community's knowledge transmission system was not rigid. It had the flexibility to recognize and redirect natural aptitude when it manifested, even when that manifestation looked like a child sneaking away from boring work to follow people who were doing something she found more interesting. Here is the picture of ancient childhood that assembles from all of these pieces. An ancient child woke up in the morning inside a community that was already active, already engaged in the day's work, already providing a continuous demonstration of everything the child would eventually need to know. She moved through the day in a flow of activity that blended play, observation, contribution, and social engagement in proportions that shifted with her age and her interest. She was supervised without being controlled, guided without being confined, and given the specific combination of freedom and embedded structure that human development optimally requires. She learned tracking by following hunters she should not have been following. She learned plant medicine by watching the community's healer with the same focused attention that she brought to everything that genuinely interested her. She learned social navigation by managing the complex dynamics of an age-mixed peer group with no adult referee. She learned the community's stories, its knowledge, its values, and its cosmological framework by being present at the fire every evening for her entire childhood, accumulating a cognitive library of everything everything her community knew. And she did all of this without a single classroom, a single textbook, a single formal curriculum. Not because her community was too primitive to provide these things, but because the structure of ancient community life, the continuous exposure to expert practice, the freedom to learn through doing, the age-mixed peer community, the evening knowledge transmission around the fire, was a learning environment of extraordinary effectiveness that produced adults capable of navigating one of the most demanding lifestyles humans have ever lived. Ancient childhood was not easy. It was not always fair. It was not, by modern standards, safe in the physical sense that modern childhood aspires to. But it was full. It was engaged. It was embedded in real life in ways that gave it meaning and purpose from the very beginning. The girl following the hunters is going to be fine. More than fine, actually. She is going to become extraordinary.